Hello class, welcome to the shorter epilogue lecture on Oedipus and philosophy, this time on Oedipus at Colonus. As an epigraph to this lecture, we can quote the poetic evocations of Oedipus and Oedipus at Colonus in the Argentinian author Jorge Luis Borges. In his poem Oedipus and the Enigma, "We are Oedipus, and everlastingly, we are the long tripartite beast. We are all that we were and will be, nothing less. It would destroy us to look steadily at our full being. Mercifully, God grants us the ticking of the clock, forgetfulness." And more in mind of Oedipus at Colonus from the poem "To My Father." "You wish to die entirely and for good, your flesh and its great soul. We saw you die with that serenely calm spirit your father had. We saw you die smiling and also blind, expecting nothing on the other side. But your shade saw and maybe barely spied those final archetypes you shared with me, that Plato the Greek dreamt. No one will find that day, for which your marble is the key." Borges here suggesting that Oedipus's final revelation is somehow related to Plato's archetypes, and is a mystery ever passed only from father to son. And so in another poem to the son, the father says, "It was not I who begot you. It was the dead, my father and his father and their forebears, in a dawn so ancient that it has become mythology by now." Before we get to Oedipus at Colonus, let's look at the final scene of Oedipus Tyrannus. Oedipus having gone off stage or obscene into the palace, it is the second messenger who comes out to relate vividly the gruesome acts that have occurred indoors. Here we have for the audience the moment of catharsis, as the highest evocation in the play of the emotions of pity and fear, and a pathos for the monstrous. The messenger says, "You spared the greatest pain of what was done. You did not see the sight, yet insofar as I remember it, you'll hear the sufferings of our unlucky queen. When she came raging into the house, she went straight to her marriage bed, tearing her hair with both of her hands, and slammed the bedroom doors behind her shut, crying upon Laius long dead. Do you remember, Laius, the night long past which bred a child for us, to send you to your death and leave a mother making children with her son?" And then she groaned and cursed the bed in which she brought forth husband by her husband, children by her own child, an infamous double bond. How after that she died I did not see, for Oedipus distracted us from seeing. He burst upon us shouting, and we looked to him as he paced frantically, begging us always, "Give me sword, I say, to find this wife, no wife, this mother's womb, this field of double sowing, whence I sprang and where I sowed my children." As he raved, some god showed him the way, but none of us there. Bellowing terribly and led by some invisible guide, he rushed on the two doors, wrenching the bending bolts out of their sockets. He charged inside, and there we saw his wife hanging, the twisted rope around her neck. When he saw her, he cried out fearfully and cut the dangling noose. Then, as she lay, poor woman, on the ground, what happened after was terrible to see. He tore the brooches, the gold-chased brooches fastening her robe, away from her, and lifting them up high, dashed them onto his own eyeballs, shrieking out such things as, "You will never see the crime I have committed or have done upon me, dark eyes. Now in the days to come, look on forbidden faces. Do not recognize those whom you long for." With such imprecations he struck his eyes again and yet again with the brooches, and the bleeding eyeballs gushed and stained his cheeks. No sluggish oozing drops out, but a black rain and bloody hail poured down. Today, groans and destruction and death and shame. Of all the ills that can be named, not one is missing. In the conclusion of the play, Oedipus announces, "It was Apollo, friends, Apollo, that brought this bitter bitterness, my sorrows to completion. But the hand that struck me was my own. Why should I see whose vision showed me nothing sweet to see?" Oedipus is exiled at his own request and becomes a wanderer. Jocasta is buried, Antigone and Ismene appear, and Oedipus laments the heavy burden his daughters are to carry. He even begs to have his daughters accompany him in his exile, but Creon rebuffs him. "Do not seek to be master in everything, for the things you master did not follow you throughout your life." And the chorus concludes, "You that live in my ancestral Thebes, behold this Oedipus. him who knew the famous riddles and was a man most masterful, not a citizen who did not look with envy on his lot. See him now and see the breakers of misfortune swallow him. Look upon that last day always, count no mortal happy, till he has passed the final limit of his life, secure from pain. So what happened to Oedipus after his exile from Thebes, which is the event of his re-exposure? He becomes an infamous, abominable, pitiful, wretched, dejected, repulsive, polluted, and yet sacred figure. He has undergone years of blind wandering, led by his daughter Antigone, who must have joined him at some point, much as the blind Tiresias was led by a boy in Oedipus Rex. He is now closer to Tiresias than ever, in some ways becoming an inverse figure of Tiresias himself and a prototype of the nomadic subject. He wanders eventually to Colonus near Athens and arrives at the Garden of the Furies, the Eumenides, in their sacred precinct as a suppliant or refugee seeking a place of abode. The gods take pity and send an oracle that whoever takes Oedipus in and grants him a place of burial will prosper. And having heard this oracle, Creon and Polynices both try to take Oedipus back to Thebes, Creon even abducting Antigone. Oedipus curses his sons brutally, and King Theseus rescues Antigone and Ismene from Creon and grants Oedipus sanctuary, and there is an esoteric death ceremony. For Jean-Joseph Goux, Oedipus at Colonus is all about what we are to make in the final analysis of Oedipus's legacy, and it outlines a second Oedipian posture that is quite different from the first, at once its epilogue and an opening to the future. For some readers, such as Mladen Dolar, Oedipus at Colonus is the Oedipus beyond Oedipus, an anti-Oedipus perhaps already for Sophocles. But for others, like Simon Critchley, Oedipus at Colonus again reflects the lessons that he has failed to learn. We know that Sophocles finished Oedipus at Colonus during the last year of his life, and it was performed 2 years before the trial and execution of Socrates. In fact, the place where Oedipus died at Colonus is very near to where Plato established his academy. We also hear from the ancient testimony that Sophocles presented this play, in which the curse of the father for the sons is so prominent, in a legal hearing against his own son, who was tired of waiting for his inheritance. Sophocles was almost 90, and so declared his father to be mentally incompetent. The play was presented at the trial as evidence of mental fitness, and his son lost the case, and it is also said that Sophocles went to die in Colonus after completing the work. What shows up most prominently in Oedipus at Colonus, in terms of the psychoanalytic literature about the so-called Oedipus complex, comes to us from Jacques Lacan's seminars, in which he points out a bit cheekily to Freud that Oedipus no doubt had many complexes, but he didn't have the complex to which he gave his name. Oedipus, at least as we read him at Colonus, did not have the Oedipus complex, and he insists throughout the play on his complete innocence, as well as absence of any desire to do the crimes he in fact did. The gods set him up from start to finish, he will insist, and he was 100% the victim of fate, for he didn't want to marry Jocasta, but had to accept the city's gift after he solved the Sphinx's riddle, and he didn't want to kill Laius, but was forced into it when he himself was under threat. On both counts, Oedipus insists that his desire is not implicated in his terrible crimes. It was all a work of the gods and of fate. As we saw in the last 2 lectures, Freud considered the Oedipus complex to be at the core of psychoanalysis and to be a modern version of tragic fate. Freud's autobiographical allusions continue with Oedipus at Colonus. When Freud was ill, he depended on his daughter, calling her my Antigone, and anyone with an elderly parent who bears scars and traumas, requires care, and hopes for reconciliation and a serene end can relate. According to Mladen Dolar in his 2018 lecture, Oedipus Revisited, which you can find in the modules this week, Freud, in his interpretation of dreams, inscribed Oedipus Rex within the pleasure principle, eros, or the desire for life, which is in conflict with the reality principle. In the Oedipus complex, incestuous desire strives, but is frustrated and repressed by the law of the father. However, when we look to Oedipus at Colonus, the pleasure principle and the reality principle, the 2 polarities of the Freudian psyche, are nowhere to be found. Rather, Oedipus at Colonus seems animated by the death drive, which is beyond both the pleasure and the reality principle. Indeed, as Dolar shows, Sophocles' chorus even seems to be aware of this death drive that drives the action. And it cites the old pessimistic dictum from Theognis and earlier tragic wisdom: the best thing is not to have been born, and the second best thing, once born, is to return to whence one came as quickly as possible. Dolar notes how Freud adds to the Greek wisdom an old Jewish witticism: of course it's best not to be born, but this happens only in 1 in 100,000 cases. In this lecture, we'll go lightly over this famous tragic dictum, and you can see Dolar's lecture on this. What we're going to try to do here, which was a bit absent in the last 2 lectures on Oedipus Rex as a figure, is read the text more carefully. The themes we find in Oedipus at Colonus are basically these. First, innocence and tragic fate, rather than being a willfully self-determining subject. As in Oedipus Tyrannus, Oedipus at Colonus is an abject object, and even an anti-hero in not truly being responsible for his crimes. Throughout, we find the relationship of fathers and their children in such topics as tainted legacy, mourning, as well as the conflicts in love and in hate of the generations. Another major theme, very Greek, in this play is the moral command for hospitality for the stranger and the foreigner. And whereas Apollo seems center stage in Oedipus Rex, it is Zeus as a god of Xenos and Xenia, a god of strangers and immigrants and suppliants, the god of hosts, of hosting and hostaging, which most sets up the tragic action. Again, what Nietzsche would call the Greeks' tragic pessimism is also at the heart of the play. Being born is the source of all evils. Best not to be, but second best is to take up a position of serenity and acceptance in the face of suffering and death. And here we find the kindly Eumenides and some measure of forgiveness by the gods. As Oedipus himself says, "It's little I ask and get still less, but quite enough for me. Acceptance, that is the great lesson suffering teaches, suffering and the long years." While we might still criticize Oedipus at various points in the play, he does utter numerous pearls of wisdom like these, such as his wisdom on impermanence. "O Theseus, dear friend, only the gods can never age, the gods can never die. All else in the world, almighty time obliterates, crushes all to nothing." And perhaps the most controversial dynamic in the play, it seems to argue in favor of an obscure mystical reversal, whereby the very worst and most accursed must of necessity as well transform into a kind of blessing. And here Oedipus becomes a full embodiment of what Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben had called homo sacer, an individual who is both accursed and outcast, but whose sacrifice somehow transforms fate into a boon and even into a blessing. Let's look now to the opening scene of the play itself in the grove of the Eumenides. Enter Oedipus from one side, old, blind, and ragged, led by Antigone. Later in the play, Polynices gives us a more detailed description of his vagabond father. Wrapped in such rags appalling, the filth of years clings to his old withered body, wasting away the skin, the flesh on his ribs, and his face, the blind sockets of his eyes, and the white hair wild, flying in the wind. The scene is Colonus, a suburb of Athens, and the old Oedipus is here both a foreigner, Xenos, and an outlaw, Anomos. He arrives in the sacred Hagnios, inviolable grove of the kindly Furies. As Derrida points out, without the knowledge of the place, and the knowledge of the name of the place, where he is going, between the profane and the sacred, the human or the divine. In Oedipus's first speech in the opening lines of the play, he speaks to Antigone. "My daughter, daughter of the blind old man, where have we come to now, Antigone? What lands are these, or holdings of what city? But now, child, if you can see a resting place, perhaps a roadside fountain or some holy grove, tell me and let me pause there and sit down, so we may learn our whereabouts and take our cue from what we hear, as strangers should. Help me sit down. Take care of the blind old man." Oedipus's first speech asks for hospitality in the grove, but his residing there is an act of profanation. He sends Antigone to find out the place from a man who seems nearby and comes closer. And Oedipus, a stranger, addresses the stranger as a friend. "Friend, my daughter's eyes serve for my own. She tells me we are fortunate enough to meet you, and no doubt you will inform us," at which he is cut off, the stranger announcing, anxiously, "Do not go on. First move from where you sit. The place is holy. It is forbidden to walk upon that ground." "What ground is this? What god is answered here?" he asks. "It is not to be touched. No one may live upon it. Most dreadful are its divinities, most feared, daughters of darkness and mysterious earth." This pointing to the chthonic and underworldly character of the Eumenides, and for the first time in the play to the theme of Oedipus's death and envelopment in the chthonic powers of the earth. Rather than heeding the friend-stranger's warning, Oedipus recognizes the place as very fitting for him, even announcing with a second Tiresian kind of sight that his arriving there and even profaning the place is ordained, I see it now, from Apollo. And so he claims the status of a suppliant to the gentle, all-seeing ones. Deliberately defiant, he announces, "I shall never leave this resting place." And here Oedipus, as a homeless foreigner, a vagabond and outcast, who had just said we should listen to strangers in a strange land, we should listen to those who are local here, he now claims a sacred prerogative from Apollo himself to seek shelter and hospitality by violating an inviolable place. We might note that he less asks for hospitality than he takes the region and its inhabitants hostage. The place is not only sacred to the Eumenides, we then learn, but also to Poseidon, Prometheus, and Colonus, the master horseman. Determining from the traveler that the land is under the protection of King Theseus of Athens, Oedipus asks forthwith for the king and promises him a great gift in exchange for a small favor. And next he prays to the Eumenides and reminds them of an oracle of Apollo about his resting place here. "Grant me then, goddesses, passage from life at last, and consummation, as the unearthly voice foretold, unless indeed I seem not worth your grace, slave as I am to such unending pain as no man had before. Pity a poor man's carcass and his ghost, for Oedipus is not the strength he was." Oedipus is less here a figure of the living, but someone like Antigone at the start of her play veers and inclines inexorably towards the dead, and is already a ghost, haunting the inviolable precinct of the Eumenides, and holding the land hostage until it helps him perform his final burial rites. Next, the chorus appears singing of the stranger, which could also translate here as vagabond or alien fool, who is impious, blasphemous, and shameless. As Derrida comments on this scene, the foreign guest appears like a ghost. He asks pity for the worthless phantom of the one who was Oedipus, and when the chorus calls him a wanderer who is not a native, Oedipus begs that even though he is a phantom, he not be taken for an outlaw, beginning to sound the theme in this play of his innocence. The chorus in turn insists that Oedipus move out of the grove, and with Antigone leading, he finally complies. "Sirs, let there be no injustice done me, once I have trusted you and left my refuge." At which the chorus replies with the famous line, "Stranger in a strange country, courage, afflicted man." In the conversation that ensues, Oedipus reluctantly reveals his identity, and the chorus immediately attempts to revoke their promise of protection by law. "Away with you, out with you, leave our country." Antigone tries to intercede and evoke their mercy and compassion and to bring them back to reason in considering the holy and religious duty, but it is Oedipus's speech which impresses them with its argument that only the highest authority is capable of judging his case, King Theseus. The chorus agrees to this, not wishing to act rashly, and so its mob fury is quelled. Ismene then arrives with news from Thebes and the latest oracle from Delphi, and seeing Ismene, Oedipus excoriates his sons for their negligence in comparison to his daughters in the matter of his care and their endless fighting for power over the vacated throne of Thebes. The latest oracle, as Ismene tells it to Oedipus, is that you shall be much solicited by our people before your death and after for their welfare. This seems to be almost an act of forgiveness on the part of the god Apollo. And Ismene goes on, "For the oracles declare their strengths in you. For the gods who threw you down sustain you now." "Slight favor," Oedipus replies, "now that I am old, my doom was early," here suggesting that all the essential narrative moments of his destiny have been completed and his fate is sealed. It is this final oracle which explains why Creon is coming to convince Oedipus to come back to Thebes, but shamefully to live outside the city with no proper burial rites when he dies. Oedipus, of course, refuses this utterly and again works up his fury towards his sons. The chorus now recommends that Oedipus perform a detailed expiatory ritual to the Eumenides for having violated their grove, which he does with the help of Ismene. And then the chorus wants to hear Oedipus's story, which he agrees to, again, very reluctantly. As Derrida explains this scene, on the charge of incest, to vindicate himself in a way to plead his case, Oedipus does accuse. He accuses without accusing anyone in particular. He accuses something rather than someone. In fact, he denounces the figure of a city, Thebes. The guilty one is Thebes. It is Thebes which, without knowing it, unconscious Thebes, the city unconscious, the unconscious at the heart of the town, polis, the political unconscious. And this is why the accusation incriminates without incriminating. How could you put on trial an unconscious or a city where neither of the two could answer for their acts? But it is Thebes, nonetheless, which, unawares, bears the responsibility of the crime. And on the charge of patricide, and as to Laius's death, Oedipus insists it was a matter of self-defense, and he was ignorant of the man's identity. Quote, "The man I murdered, he'd have murdered me," thus claiming both self-defense and mens rea, lack of intention to commit a crime. One might think that having heard the oracle as a young man about killing his father and marrying his mother, he might avoid killing older men and marrying older women, and so bear some responsibility, no? But Oedipus at Colonus appears to have thought even of this, and notes that few would ask an aggressor if he was by chance his father. As Derrida goes on, when Theseus arrives, he takes pity on the blind old man, and he has not forgotten, he says, that he too grew up as a foreigner and put his life at risk in a foreign land. Like the oath to come, this exchange makes an alliance between two foreigners. As Theseus asks Oedipus, "Tell me your wish then, let me hear it now." And Oedipus replies, "I come to give you something, and the gift is my own beaten self. No feast for the eyes, yet in me is a more lasting grace than beauty." Oedipus promises Theseus a gift to be fully and secretly revealed only at his burial, and asks for protection from the city of Thebes. This gift is religious and military in that it will involve the grace of the gods to Athens in any future war with Thebes. Theseus is confused at first because Thebes is at this time an ally of Athens, but he notes that this could change. "Most gentle son of Aegeus, the immortal gods alone have neither age nor death. All other things almighty time disquiets. Earth wastes away, the body wastes away, faith dies, distrust is born, and imperceptibly the spirit changes between a man and his friend, or between two cities." At which Oedipus makes a murderous promise on behalf of his very ghost, "And then my sleeping and long hidden corpse, cold in the earth, will drink hot blood of theirs, if Zeus endures, if his son's word is true. However, there's no felicity in speaking of hidden things." At this, Theseus and the chorus leader accept all of Oedipus's wishes and terms and declare him an ally, friend, and citizen of Athens, and promise him protection. This leads to the most beautiful chorus in Oedipus at Colonus, the welcoming chorus, which we won't read here in detail, but which you're advised not to miss, especially in its connection of festive hospitality to the god Dionysus and his Theseus, immortal Maenads in his train. And we also have Herline's translation of this chorus, a fragment towards his never completed translation of Oedipus at Colonus. To keep this lecture short, we'll skip the arrival arguments and conflicts with Creon, and later his son Polynices. Suffice to say, Theseus and Athens do keep their word to protect Oedipus and his daughters, and that Oedipus proves both implacable and self-centered in uttering his famous curse and disownment, both of Thebes and of his son. The kidnapping scenes are also relevant in that they show a more villainous Creon and the backstory of Anticles, Polynices, Ismene, and Antigone, which we'll be turning to next week. Again, don't miss the choral song from lines 1200 to 1250, which are the perfect expression of tragic pessimism. Instead, what I'd like to focus on here is the ending of Oedipus at Colonus itself, the finale, final death, and transfiguration of Oedipus, The beginning of Oedipus's final descent into the house of Hades is marked in the text when a terrific peal of thunder is heard. Ah, Zeus, heaven's height has cracked. Then the final two scenes of the drama involve first the mysterious death and transformation of Oedipus, and then the laments of Antigone and Ismene in being denied knowledge of his place of burial, and thus denied proper mourning. Again, in his text of Hospitality, Derrida asks what happens at the end of Oedipus at Colonus. As we were saying, Oedipus illustrates this strange law of hospitality. You die abroad, and not always at all as you would have wanted. In this tragedy of written and unwritten laws, before living the experience of the last duty to render one of her dead brothers, Antigone endures and names that dreadful thing, being deprived of the father's tomb. Deprived above all, like her sister Ismene, of the knowledge as to the father's last resting place, and worse, in being deprived of this by the father, according to the wishes of the father himself. It is thus the final scene of Oedipus at Colonus, her incomplete mourning of her father, that we must keep in mind in her decision to defy Creon's edict and bury her brother Polynices in the Antigone. Recall the earlier foreshadowing. At lines 126, lightning and thunder will summon Oedipus to some great consummation at the end. This came from the son of Zeus and was Apollo's vengeful promise that in death Oedipus will be a blessing to the hosts I live among and a disaster to those who drove me out. At this point, another major theme of the play seems to be that of revenge. Now Zeus, as god of oaths and suppliants, or the stranger, the foreigner, grants Oedipus his request, the tolling death bell of his final resting place, and thunder and lightning break out furiously, marking the passage to death, as well as Oedipus's uncanny self-reflection. I have been saved for something great and terrible, something strange, Denos. And Oedipus now speaks to Tiresias. I shall disclose to you, O son of Aegeus, what is appointed for you and for your city, a thing that age will never wear away, effectively promising immortality to Athens, despite his own wisdom of impermanence. Presently now, without a soul to guide me, I'll lead you to the place where I must die, but you must never tell it to any man, not even the neighborhood in which it lies, perhaps fearing desecration of his tomb. He goes on, if you obey, this will count more for you than many shields and many neighbors' spears. These things are mysteries not to be explained, but you will understand when you come there alone. Alone, because I cannot disclose it to any of your men or to my children, much as I love and cherish them. But you keep it secret always, and when you have come to the end of life, then you must hand it on to your most cherished son, and he in turn must teach it to his heir, and so on forever. And so, in a very strange turn of events for the blind wanderer who ever required Antigone to lead his way, Oedipus, though still blind, now leads with a second sight. Let us proceed now to that place and hesitate no longer. I am driven by an insistent voice that comes from God. Children, follow me this way. See, now I have become your guide as you were mine. Come, but do not touch me. Let me alone discover the holy and funereal ground where I must take this fated earth to be my shroud. This way, O come, the angel of the dead, Hermes, and veiled Persephone lead me on. Hermes Psychopompos being the guide of the dead into and out of Hades, and Persephone the regal queen of the salvation of the soul in the underworld, seeming to speak simultaneously to the sun and to Theseus, to Helios, and perhaps implicitly to Apollo, calling him a most cherished friend. O sunlight of no light, once you were mine, this is the last my flesh will feel of you, for now I go to shade my ending day in the dark underworld. Most cherished friend, I pray that you and this your land and all your people may be blessed. Remember me, be mindful of my death, and be fortunate in all the time to come. The chorus then sings two beautiful strophes to help prepare for Oedipus a blessed passage into the realm of Persephone, and a messenger returns to relate all that he saw before the secret hidden rite was performed. And there are at least two secrets here. The secret place, Cora, where Oedipus alone with Theseus dies and is buried, his final dwelling place, and the secret funeral, words that Oedipus utters to Tiresias. Derrida, ever the philosopher of the secret, of course has words to say on Oedipus's secret, for at the moment of dying, Oedipus enjoins Theseus never to reveal to anyone, particularly his daughters, the whereabouts of his tomb. It is as if he wanted to depart without leaving so much as an address for the mourning of the women who love him. He acts as if he wanted to make their mourning infinitely worse, to weigh it down even with the mourning they can no longer do. He is going to deprive them of their mourning, thereby obliging them to go through their mourning of mourning. It is the first and most enduring secret that most concerns Oedipus's daughters, Antigone and Ismene. The transmission of the secret patriarchally and filially will here, Derrida observes, be guaranteed at this price: good tradition, the one that will rescue the city, the one that will guarantee the political safety of the city. It is said that it will be born, like tradition itself, through the transmission of a secret, not just any living secret, but a secret concerning the clandestine site of a death, namely the death of Oedipus. When the messenger comes back to relate the limit of what he saw, he underlines above all his amazement, thomastos, while the blind man led all near his final resting place, somewhere near the stone bowl that marks Theseus's and Pirithous' covenant. First, Oedipus allowed his daughters to come, to wash him, attend him, and care for him with water from the hill crest of the goddess Demeter, freshener of all things. When the ablutions and libations were complete, the earth groaned, and they all fell to weeping in each other's arms, making speeches of farewell and sobbing, and they wept for a very long time, almost too long. For after a silence in their wailing, they hear a spirit voice cry out, "Oedipus, Oedipus, why are you waiting? You delayed too long. You delayed too long to go." As Derrida puts it, Oedipus then pushes on towards this place that he keeps a secret. He wants to avoid being late for this sort of rendezvous with the gods. It would be worth following the motif of delay and haste in the rhythm of this journey, a halting and hastening that marks the beat of this tragedy. At this point, Oedipus sends his daughters away and goes on, who the messenger only sees with his hands before his face, shading his eyes as if from something fearful, awesome, and unendurable to see. As to the manner of Oedipus's actual death, it remains forever a mystery. We hear of neither lightning nor fire, but perhaps a spirit came for him from above or opened the doors below. Quote, "For he was taken without lamentation, illness, or suffering. Indeed, his end was wonderful, if a mortal's ever was." Let us recall here Nietzsche's interpretation of Oedipus Tyrannus, and more indirectly of Oedipus at Colonus in his The Birth of Tragedy, covered in the last lecture. Recall how Oedipus Rex is active in the search for truth, but at the same time accedes to the position of being a passive and horrified spectator before it. In light of the final catharsis of the drama and Oedipus's exile, it seems almost as though a holy serenity pervaded the entire work. These words he applied to Oedipus Tyrannus, but we might tend to think they apply even more to Oedipus at Colonus, indeed, from its very first line, although doing so would tend to overlook the arrogance, vengeful rage, and fury that still seem very much a part of Oedipus's character in this play. Yes, Oedipus at Colonus seems more wise, pious, and accepting, even serene in his fate, but has he learned tragic wisdom in the acceptance of suffering? Perhaps yes, and perhaps no. Is Oedipus at Colonus somehow a drama of affirmation? In order to answer these questions, let's look into Goux' penultimate chapter, which provides a more succinct interpretation of Oedipus at Colonus. Recall how, according to Goux, Oedipus Rex's posture with respect to the Sphinx, Tiresias, and religious authority in general is what made him, in hindsight, a symbolic figure of philosophical autonomy and rationalism. Oedipus at Colonus dramatizes what lies beyond, for it is in this final of his plays that Sophocles himself transcends and even heals the self-centered subject. Oedipus Rex thought he could avoid the initiatory ordeal. In fact, he only postponed it, destined to live out the moment that he evaded. In this way, just as Oedipus Rex is for Goux a drama of failed royal investiture and initiation, Oedipus Colonus is a drama of fulfilled telestic passage, the fruit of a whole life in its coinciding with death. The threshold situation, or liminal moment, first defined as the encounter with the Sphinx, and the ambiguity of the forces of Apollo and Dionysus is never really over. It pervades Oedipus's whole life and shows up in Colonus in his very arrival in the grove of the Eumenides, a ghost between life and death, at the threshold between mortality and the gods. The human condition in its entirety is a liminal state, and Oedipus at Colonus dramatizes this liminoid subjectivity in its existential negativity. Indeed, the elderly Oedipus is a poignant figure of destitution and the most total dispossession imaginable. He has lost everything: youth, power, homeland, eyes, strength, pride. He is old, blind, exiled, vagabond, miserable, tired, dependent, impure, and accursed. And yet, having played out his own catastrophe to proverbial rock bottom, Oedipus at Colonus becomes a tale of reversal, uplifting, and redemption. Its lesson, according to Goux, is that even the most degraded person can become a source of benediction. And Oedipus is transfigured by Zeus, the god of suppliance and hospitality, as in the early Nietzsche, into a saint. Initiation avoided becomes initiation accomplished. The suppliant's plea is heard and responded to by the gods, and humility replaces presumption, and a sacral atmosphere replaces a pedantic, moralizing, tyrannical, or dogmatic one. I'm not sure how much this reading can be maintained if we had looked more closely into the dialogues of Oedipus with Creon and Polynices. In any case, although rituals of purification and expiation are required, in the end, the awesome goddesses, the Eumenides, and the great king Theseus grant asylum and Oedipus's self-willed death. In this way, according to Goux, Oedipus is transformed from an untouchable human wreck into a perpetual and inexhaustible treasure. As Ismene says to Oedipus, "The gods are about to raise you to your feet. Till now they were bent on your destruction." And the chorus also to Oedipus, "Numberless agonies, blind and senseless, now let some power, some justice grant him glory." And again, as Oedipus himself asks poignantly, "So, when I am nothing, then am I a man?" At least here and in a few other places, Oedipus does demonstrate a holy humility. And in the extraordinary finale, when Zeus's thunder announces Oedipus's hour of death, he reveals to Theseus alone an ultimate secret, thereby becoming the founder of a symbolic lineage, a lineage that will not pass from father to son per se, but from sovereign to sovereign, from subject to subject. The chain of symbolic transmission across generations is restored, and nature's inviolability has been re-established. The existential negativity has been sanctified and redeemed. If Oedipus the king is a tragedy of profanation, Oedipus at Colonus is imbued from beginning to end with an intensely sacral atmosphere. This sacredness has a dual aspect. Not only is it opposed to the profane, but is itself permeated by archaic ambivalence. The sacredness of impurity and transgression meets up with the sacredness of purification, which in many ways is the very heart of the catharsis that is Greek tragedy. The well-known movement characteristic of every initiatory passage, a raising up after a lowering, is at the center of the drama here. And Oedipus's final exoteric speech to Theseus before disclosing his secret is formulated in the precise language of initiatory instruction. According to Goux, Oedipus does not abandon his unique perspective, and this explains the continuities of his character, but he does consecrate his own sacrality under the triple sign of death, foreign soil, and secrecy. Oedipus's final knowledge is indeed destined for the future. While we do not know the words in which Oedipus formulated it, we can assume for Goux that it is a new position. We do not know Oedipus's secret, and yet it is this unknown knowledge that henceforth governs the destiny of Athens. If the unconscious is that part of the soul that continues to live, to feel, and to perceive in a spective, but in a culture massively dominated by the subject's constitution in perspective, we might call this third figure the secret of Oedipus, transpective. Goux's argument gets a little tortuous here in its combination of the history of philosophy with psychoanalysis of the unconscious. If Oedipus Tyrannus marks out the dangers implied in the closure of traditional religion, the wisdom of Tiresias, and the emergence of the ego-centered perspective of self-consciousness, then Oedipus at Colonus might be configured as a postmodern prototype for resacralization and re-enchantment. Oedipus's gesture of ego-centering is not suppressed, but comes to mark the continued presence within subjectivity of the aspective or unconscious as irreducible, whether it appears in dreams, fantasies, or the presence of the gods. Speaking anachronistically, the old Oedipus should have been the first to know that the unconscious exists. The ancient gods have ceased to be external, but become internal to the psyche. We, for our part, might easily imagine that this was the secret message to Theseus and all his Athenian posterity. It's hard to imagine that Sophocles had something like this in mind. For Goux, the madness of Oedipus has become Western reason. And what the Oedipus myth and Sophocles' plays ultimately teach us is that modern humanity's destiny is one of prolonged liminality, experienced in an uncompletable, open, and undecidable process of auto-initiation. More positively, Goux suggests that modern humanity can transcend the aporias of the Oedipian ego through the itinerary of Oedipus himself, through the position achieved at Colonus. But this transcendence is in Goux's conclusion still ambiguous. There is no question of blindly asserting the truth conveyed by the myth, of countering all the radical attempts at autonomy, all the forms of auto-centered subjectivity, with the timeless curse promised by the story of Oedipus. Such is not my intention. And so we cannot choose between two Oedipus figures, the philosopher king of Thebes and the dispossessed saint of Colonus. While the narrative logic of theater can produce these two positions only in succession, we must think them through together as the tension that constitutes the Occidental subject in its tragic dimension. At the other extreme of Goux's more saintly, then perverse Oedipus at Colonus, we might contrast Simon Critchley's more pragmatic remarks. Tragedy is about the lessons we fail to learn more than anything else, and Critchley is confused why so many readers find serene redemption in Oedipus at Colonus. Are they simply not reading the text? For when we do read the text carefully, a monstrous perversion is still present. The subliminal theme of the play even being a reversal of the structures in Oedipus Tyrannus. Now Oedipus desires to slay the sons and marry the daughters, and he returns in the end to Mother Earth. Jeremy Tambling, in his appendix on Oedipus at Colonus, in the book Hölderlin and the Poetry of Tragedy, might tend to agree. Tambling reads Oedipus at Colonus as a mortal Prometheus, noting how the grove in Colonus was also sacred to Prometheus, and Tambling, like Critchley, has no desire to whitewash Oedipus at Colonus's continuing violence, anger, and tragic madness. Quote, "His character is madness. He fulfills Freud's definition. A hero is someone who has had the courage to rebel against his father and has in the end victoriously overcome him." While we can't find Oedipus making any statements to this effect in the play, it is true that heroes in Greek mythology are always monstrous. We can compare Ajax, Hercules, and Philoctetes, who are all, like Oedipus at Colonus, outcasts, abject, and exiles. The Thebans dread Oedipus's anger, and the Athenians want to placate him. The image of Oedipus from the tomb, drinking warm blood, is cannibalistic, angry, Oedipal, the ancestor consuming the sons. And gone down into the underworld, Oedipus remains double, like many heroes, a benediction to Athens, but a curse to others. As Tambling points out, even Oedipus's first act is to intrude, without knowing it, into a feminine space, a holy place, saying that some omen has conducted him. The grove implies the mother's presence, and going into it repeats Oedipus's incestuous crossing over. The grove holds vines belonging to Dionysus and olive trees belonging to Athena, and laurel, the plant of Apollo, with nightingales audible, as a reminder of murder, rape, and lamentation. And Tambling quotes from Lacan in Seminar 2 on Oedipus at Colonus that here we find a figure who has gone beyond the pleasure principle and the reality principle and is no longer anything at all, enacting rather the mad wisdom of the death drive, with its maxim that the greatest boon is not to have been. Rather than a tragic saint who has learned his lessons and attained serenity, what Lacan finds in Oedipus at Colonus is Oedipus's total absence of charity, of fraternity, and anything whatsoever related to what one calls human feeling. From the start to the finish of this play, he has become nothing more than the scum of the earth, the refuse, the residue, a thing empty of any plausible appearance. living a life which is dead and veering towards that death which is precisely there under life. The final words of Oedipus are a final malediction on life and the Thebans, and Oedipus, like life, simply doesn't want to be healed. Just as Oedipus Tyrannus self-blindingly tears himself away from appearances as the only way to achieve truth, so Oedipus at Colonus demands his unyielding right to the end, demanding everything, giving up nothing, absolutely unreconciled. And so Oedipus, betrayed by Thebes and his sons, crosses over into death, much as does King Lear. These two extremes of reading Oedipus at Colonus, on the one hand as an image of healing redemption, and on the other of unsalvageable monstrosity and the death drive, are perhaps both a little too extreme, and this is perhaps why Derrida sidesteps these issues in approaching the themes of hospitality and the oath. Quote, Oedipus demands that he not be forgotten, because look out, if he were forgotten, everything would go badly. Now he addresses this threatening plea and this calculated injunction to the Xenos, the dearest foreigner or host, the host as friend, but the host who is friend and ally, and who thereby becomes a sort of hostage, the hostage of a dead man, the possible prisoner of a potential absent person. In other words, Oedipus's withdrawal into death is a holding the host, Theseus, and his descendants hostage. And while this may be a negative moment in the drama, Derrida insists that in this gesture, Oedipus is a bit like Christ. He makes of his dying person a demanding, "This is my body, keep it in memory of me," and makes Theseus swear an oath to this effect. And so Derrida might concur with Goux, at least this far. Western culture has been held hostage to this often hostile Oedipian legacy, within which Oedipus remains a ghost and a haunting of the modern subject. In the words of Levinas, the subject is a host, the subject is a hostage. Rather than dwell on the figure of Oedipus himself, Derrida is much more interested in the fate of the daughters, Antigone and Ismene, a fate which is one of impossible mourning. When Oedipus's daughters ask him if they can see the holy tomb, Theseus will refuse, invoking the orkos that links him to the god. And so Antigone is right in her complaints. She complains that her father has died in a foreign land, moreover is buried in a place foreign to any possible localization. She weeps at being deprived of a normal mourning. She weeps for her mourning. Here the only possible mourning for Antigone is an impossible mourning. Theseus has to remind Antigone that Oedipus's encryption in secret is the will of Oedipus and an oath to Zeus, and Derrida comments on Oedipus as figure, in a mode similar to Goux or Lucula Barth. Oedipus, the first man to Hegel, like Oedipus, the last man to Nietzsche, wanted not only to pass away, but to become unfindable for his relations, removed from their mourning, carrying himself away and carrying them into the abyss of a mourning, actually mourning its own mourning. And so the last of the plays that Sophocles wrote, Oedipus at Colonus, over a quarter century after his Antigone, closes with Antigone herself mourning the father, much as she will mourn the dead Polynices. In that play she will defy the sovereign Creon's authority, but here she accepts Theseus's prohibition against access to her father's tomb, accepting his last wish and her impossible mourning. Theseus asks, "What is it you would want me to agree to?" Antigone, "We wish to see our father's tomb ourselves, but it is not permitted to go there." "What do you mean, Lord, ruler of Athens?" "Children, that man forbade me to allow anyone to approach the region or to address the holy spot he occupies. And he said that if I do, this country will be always free of grief. So the god heard this being said by us, and so did Oath, Orkos, son of Zeus, who hears everything." And Antigone replies, "If that is what he wants, that is enough. But send us to ancient Thebes in the hope we may prevent the slaughter that is coming to our brothers." Theseus complies with their wishes, and the chorus sings, "Now let the weeping cease, let no one mourn again. These things are in the hands of the gods." Thanks for listening to this third and final installment of the series Oedipus and Philosophy, From Thebes to Colonus and Beyond. And we'll see you next week when we turn to the play Antigone. Have a good week.